All right, students, good morning. We are going to be discussing India today. So we're going to take a trip to the Indus Valley and discuss some of the civilizations that we find there. So, without further ado, let's head right in. Okay, so we refer to India as a subcontinent. Okay, so if you think of your continents, North America, South America, Antarctica, Africa, Europe, Asia, and Oceania or Australia, those are large, very large land masses. India is technically part of Asia, but we call it a subcontinent because if we were to go back into, continental drift times millions of years ago, India likely drifted north from the Indian Ocean where it crashed into the Asian continent, creating the two main mountain ranges, the Karakoram Mountains and the Hindu Kush Mountains that run through Pakistan, and the Himalayas, which run through Nepal between India and China, or today India and Tibet. So those two mountain ranges really help to separate India from the rest of Asia. So we refer to India as a subcontinent because it's kind of all by itself. We're below a continent, right? So it's not quite a continent, but it's by itself enough and separated enough that we kind of view it that way. So, as far as major regions to discuss, I mentioned those mountain ranges. So let me we'll start with those. So you have the Hindu Kush Mountains, which run through Pakistan up in this region. And then, of course, the Karakoram Mountains, which are kind of part of this mountain range, are up above it. You have the Himalayas, which run through here. And of course, Mount Everest is here in Nepal, highest mountain this side of the water. And in the over here in the Hindu Kush Mountains, there is a pathway that we're going to discuss known as the Khyber Pass. So it's kind of a passage through the mountains where people are able to travel. You've got the Deccan Plateau here in this kind of central region. So the Deccan Plateau is a raised, arid plateau region in kind of central India. Then we have the eastern and western Ghats, which are like low mountain ranges, almost like large hills. Think like the Appalachian Mountains. Right? So these aren't the Himalayas, but they kind of help to frame that triangular shape of India there. And then the Thar Desert right up here in this kind of region up to the northwest northwest of the Deccan Plateau. And then that Indo-Gangetic Plain, so that's the region where the Indus and Ganges rivers are located. Again, here's that map. Take a little bit better look at it. You can see some of the countries that we're also going to be discussing. You've got Pakistan to the northwest of India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Bangladesh to the northeast and east, and then Sri Lanka directly south down there, as well as the Maldives, those islands to the southwest. So, India's geography is really formative in kind of how it operates as a country. So, it's you have this Indus River Valley. You can kind of see very lightly on this map the Indus River. So it would flow down out of the mountains here and a few different tributary regions into the larger Indus River, which flows out into the Arabian Sea over here. Okay, so you can see that river. That's in modern day Pakistan, near the Hindu Kush Mountains, which run through Pakistan. But in ancient times, this would have been all considered India. India is isolated because of those natural barriers. So even though it's very diverse culturally, that diversiveness comes from within. So the many different groups of people there allow it to be diverse, not so much that it's mixing too much with exterior civilizations, at least not until the later part of Indian history. You also have the monsoons that we need to discuss. You can see on this map it shows kind of these large sweeping arrows coming up from the south, and then you've got some red ones coming down from the north. Now, those represent the monsoons, which are seasonal winds. This is up to 80% of India's rainfall that comes from these monsoons. So warm winds from the south and cold, dry winds from the north definitely influence India's temperature as well as its climate. And a lot of the agriculture in India is very dependent on how these monsoons operate. They are good for the Indian civilization in that they bring water for the people. Of course, they're bad because they lead to massive flooding in the Indus and Ganges river valleys, which can lead to destruction and death of the villages located there. So here's a map that again details those locations that we already kind of discussed: Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. So you can kind of see where these are located as part of the Indian subcontinent, and get a better feel for that. Now, of course, in ancient times, most of this region would have just been considered India. So that's worth bearing in mind as we go forward. But those countries sort of form themselves as time goes on, and definitely are distinct now. Especially if you look at different cultural differences or ethnicities. If you were to go to Pakistan or Bangladesh, you would find much higher Muslim majority populations versus India, which is of course very much influenced by Hinduism, Nepal, Buddhism, and so forth. So you definitely see those cultural differences when you look that way. So these early civilizations, we've got the Harappan civilization, or the Harappa. Now, this is sort of like when we talked about the Minoa, the Minoan peoples. We don't know a lot about them because we don't understand their language. Same case here with the Harappan civilization. We know a lot less about them because we have not been able to decipher their language. We have lots of evidence of it, we just can't read it. We do know that they had two major cities. There's Harappa here in kind of this northern region, if you look up the map, Harappa, and then Mohenjo-Daro right down here. So both of those cities are part of this civilization, and they were very advanced for their times. 2- and 3-story buildings laid out in a grid street pattern, so showing planned cities, showing infrastructure, strong central government. We know that there was a lot of art. We have evidence of that as well. We just can't actually nail down, what it all means to be precise. We have lots of evidence of that civilization, especially archaeological evidence. It's just a matter of being able to understand the history of it, so to speak. So we know that the Harappan civilization was part of a larger world. Let me get my picture out of the way so you all can see this. So we know that they traded both by sea and land with Mesopotamia. We have found evidence in Mesopotamia of Indian goods and seals. We've found the reverse true to be in India. So we know that they traded, which shows, larger planning. It also shows kind of that awareness of other civilizations, the global interconnectedness of the time. But eventually, the Harappan civilization disappears. Now we can talk about all the different ways that this probably happened, right? There's lots. The main three that often get discussed are earthquakes, massive earthquakes that shift the way the rivers flow or something like that would lead to distress for the Harappan civilization, leading to its collapse. Of course, over-farming. If the land is over-farmed, you'll see reduction in crops, won't be able to sustain a large population, so they'll have to move. Or there's the option of conquest. Now, I put this second bullet on here because I don't think it's so easy to pick out one thing and say, this is the reason everything happened. I think that you have to be a bit more flexible than that. I think we have to look at how some or all of these could have influenced one another. So there could have been an earthquake, which led to some river shifts, which led to panicked over farming. Eventually, you're going to have conquest that comes in on top of that. We know the Harappan peoples were relatively peaceful. We found evidence of toys, but not a lot of weapons. So that leads us to believe that there wasn't much infighting. So they probably weren't prepared for any type of invasion. Now, the major theory that goes along with this, the major theory. So the Aryan migration hypothesis is the main idea put forward that explains where these people coming into India came from, as well as other things. So that word Aryan should seem familiar to you. We discussed the Aryan peoples back when we talked about Adolf Hitler. This is kind of reminiscent of that. It's the same idea. He would have been referring to the same peoples. As you can see on that map on the bottom, that arrow shows it migrating into Eastern Europe. That's kind of what Adolf Hitler was drawing a conclusion from, where those Aryan peoples, those ancient conquerors, had made their way into Europe, and that's who he was kind of trying to draw back to. Now, of course, these Indo-European Aryan peoples that went to India, not exactly the same in the sense that they are, the German race that Hitler was looking for. This is more discussing the idea that a Caucasian group of people, and I mean that from the mountain range, that Middle Eastern group had migrated into India. And, we can look at this as a migration or an invasion. And I've heard it both ways. There's strong evidence to support both. We don't know, and that's the simple fact. We have to go based on what evidence we do have. We know that if this happened, it was through the Hindu Kush mountain pass known as the Khyber Pass, and that these people would have mixed with and or asserted control and dominance over a group of people in India known as the Dravidians, who are kind of seen as the native peoples of India. So those Aryan people are considered significant because with them comes the basis for most of later Indian life. Because, of course, if they migrate or they invade, they're going to assert dominance or spread culture. Right? You're going to see cultural diffusion come there. So, bringing early Hinduism in, editing the social structure by bringing in what's known as the caste system, and then they're writing Sanskrit. And in return, being able to survive in the land is what they would have received, or having, a population to serve them. So if you look at that picture in the upper left, that's Brahma, who's kind of the chief deity of the Hindu religion. And we'll talk about that because it's confusing a little bit, and we're going to touch on that as we go. And then you can see Sanskrit, the writing down at the bottom. And of course, the caste system is explained through Purusha, or in this case Brahma, right? The head being the teachers and the priests, the arms being the warriors, the thighs, being the traders and the merchants, the feet, the Shudra, the workers, the laborers, and then the Dalits, the outcasts, outside of everything, the Dalit. As far as Indian literature goes, there's four main things which we're going to focus on. The Vedas, or the Vedic tradition, based on the Rig Veda being the oldest, is a collection of hymns and poems and prayers that are all related to Hinduism. You have the Upanishads, which we'll talk about in a moment. The Upanishads are kind of a piece that is more seen as a commentary or an explanation. It's framed as a discussion. You have the Mahabharata, which is it's a collection of epic poems. The probably most significant of which is the Bhagavad Gita, and then the Ramayana, which is like it's not a novel, but it's like a religiously based dharmic story, which tries to explain, the appropriate role and the way that an individual should act, kind of the ideal person. So here's the Upanishads and Ramayana and the Mahabharata that I was just discussing. That's more of a summary than I was just able to give. I will share a copy of. I'm not going to share the whole Mahabharata because it's incredibly long, but I'll share a version of the Bhagavad Gita for you, as well as like a I don't want to say cartoon, but basically a cartoon version of that story, which tries to also summarize it. All right, so here's the caste system. So, we've talked about social structures before. Initially, the caste system is thought to have been based on skin color. These varnas, or these layers of the caste system. The higher up you were, the more closely related to that Aryan peoples you were. and down the ladder that went. So the Brahmin represent the priests; they're up at the top. Kshatriyas are the warriors and kings. The Vaishyas are the merchants and farmers, and then the Shudra are the laborers. Now, the untouchables, the Dalit, the Harjan, the outcasts, are not a part of the system at all. So they're outside the caste system. It's where we get the word outcast. They're not allowed to directly associate with members of the caste system or members of the rest of their civilization. They're definitely not allowed to intermarry. They're not even really allowed to touch them, hence untouchables. They do all of the jobs that are considered dirty or lowly. Now, the other important thing to note about the caste system is these individual varnas, the individual layers, did not intermix with one another. They did not intermarry. And I always have students go, well, what if somebody fell in love? It's not the way this works. Okay, so most of these marriages in India during this period are, and even still somewhat today, are arranged marriages. So parents arrange marriages while the children are very young, and when they come of age, they're able to get married. Those marriages are based on making sure that those individuals fit the varna that you are allowed to marry within. So it definitely helps to solidify that hierarchy. That's going to stay for a long period of time because there's no social mobility, and that's one of the things that the Bhagavad Gita talks about. If you are born as a kshatriya, you're supposed to be a warrior, like in the Bhagavad Gita in the story. If you're supposed to be a warrior, and you are a terrible warrior, you just aren't good at fighting. It's not what you're into. You don't like that. You instead, maybe you are really, really good at making like clay sculptures, and you want to be an artist, right? So that would be under this Vaishya class. You're really, really good at that. Doesn't matter, right? You are better off being an unsuccessful or bad warrior if you're a kshatriya than being a good sculptor, because it's not part of your assigned caste. Right? It's not what your caste is supposed to do. Anyway, we'll come back to that later when we start talking about some of the other points. But we're going to kind of jump sideways and talk about religion. Now, I know if you're doing the computer program side of this, a lot of this doesn't match, but that's okay. Just come back to this, whenever you need it. So, Hinduism is the main religion that kind of evolves out of that early Aryan texts and religions that they bring. And it has a few principles that it's sort of built off of. So the Vedas and Upanishads are the sacred texts of this. As far as gods go, and I'll have that on the next slide, Hinduism's messy, so we'll get to that. Samsara, which is known as reincarnation, is the process of rebirth. So, an individual lives their life, and if they live a good life, they collect karma, right? Hopefully good karma, meaning you have done good deeds in your life. So when you die and you go through the process of samsara, of reincarnation, you're reincarnated in a higher caste. You follow dharma, which is kind of the cosmic law that binds everything together, including knowing your role and your responsibility in your particular varna that you're born into. And basically, you live a very good life that you're supposed to live. And then when you die and are reincarnated, maybe you'll be higher in the caste system. The ultimate goal is something called moksha, which is the release from the cycle of reincarnation and achievement of perfect understanding, right? You're kind of out of the torment of being reborn. So when we think about this for a second, if we think about the religious purpose of this, it's it definitely does a lot to explain the ways their civilization is. But if we think about this from the other end, if we think about this as a means of social control, right, you've kind of divided up society to fill certain roles that are necessary, but maybe not everybody would want to do, right? Not everybody wants to be a laborer, but it's necessary that you have laborers. So by filling those roles, and then laying a religion over top of that and saying you need to do a very good job in this role if you want to be better off in your next life. Okay, so that forces people to actually fulfill the role that they are assigned rather than striving to do something different. So here's those Hindu gods. Hinduism, a lot of times it's confused. A lot of times we say it's monotheistic because they have one god, Brahma, who takes many forms. Sometimes we say it's polytheistic because there's those many forms. They can appear as many different gods. So it's very messy. Instead, it's better if we look at it, as being as henotheistic. So henotheistic is actually when you have one god who takes multiple forms. Now, there's multiple manifestations of Brahma. There's, of course, Brahma himself, the kind of creator. But you have Vishnu, you have Shiva, you have Kali, you have Ganesh. So there are a lot of different forms of Brahma. And it's worth remembering when you kind of see these different iterations of the Hindu god that these are all significant. They all have different roles, but they are all interconnected in Hindu belief. Let's talk about Buddhism. So Buddhism is founded by an individual known as Siddhartha Gautama. So this is a historical person, Siddhartha. He was a king, or prince rather, in a small kingdom in Nepal. And Siddhartha, of course, being a prince, he's part of the Kshatriya caste. And then he sets out from his home, and I'll show there's a movie that does a good job kind of explaining this, known as Little Buddha. We get to see Keanu Reeves play Siddhartha, which is of course fun. But I'll share that with you guys as well, just so you can get some visuals. But Siddhartha is confined to his palace, basically. And so he ends up leaving his palace, and he witnesses pain and suffering that exists outside of his palace. So he sees, people that are old, people that are sick, people that are dying. And he comes to understand that there's more to the world than what he had seen. So he seeks answers through meditation and ends up coming up with what's known as the Four Noble Truths. As well as this eventual concept of Buddhism. So the Four Noble Truths are that all life is filled with suffering and sorrow, and suffering is maybe a poor translation because it's not the suffering pain that you feel, but more the internal suffering, more conflict, right? Internal conflict or internal strife. That you may feel, want or guilt or desire, right? All of those sort of internal emotions. So the cause for that suffering is selfish desire, right? That we want the temporary pleasures of the world. And the way for us to end this desire end this suffering is to end the desire. And the way to do that is to follow what he calls the Eightfold Path, or the middle way, which is kind of how to walk the line of suffering and self-denial. So that you have to live by the Eightfold Path if you're going to try and avoid suffering in your life. So here's that Eightfold Path. You can see, the right view, knowing the truth, freeing your mind of evil. Right speech, say nothing that's going to hurt someone, so not intentionally, right? The right livelihood, have a respectful life. The right mindfulness, having control of your thoughts. There's a lot of this stuff which kind of seems simple, but if you think about how hard it actually might be, right? The right intentions for your mind of evil. Don't do anything that's evil. Now, evil subjective, but Buddha would have meant this to be anything that's kind of meant to give you intentional gain and someone else intentional loss. So think about how difficult that might actually be to do. So Siddhartha becomes known as the Buddha, or the enlightened one. So this becomes the goal, this enlightenment, which is known as nirvana, becomes the goal of Buddhism, and that's the release from suffering and sorrow in life. There's two major schools, Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism. The Theravada Buddhism believes in teachers, so like a Buddhist teacher, versus Mahayana Buddhism, which more focuses on Buddha himself as quote unquote the great vehicle, right, as being almost a god in that sort of train of thought. All right, so we have two empires to discuss. The first is known as the Mauryan Empire. It's founded by Chandragupta Maurya. And this starts 322 is when the empire starts. So if you kind of remember when we discussed before about Alexander very briefly, this is picking up right after Alexander's death, because Chandragupta is going to defeat one of Alexander's generals and successors, a guy named Seleucus. So when he defeats Seleucus, he's able to kind of consolidate India as a country, as an empire. Now it's a very developed empire. Of course, these great architectural achievements like the stupa that you see down here below, art, warfare, to be able to defeat, a Macedonian army under the rule of one of Alexander's generals. That's no small achievement, no matter how far out that had been from its actual, initial glory days. Maybe if we look at bureaucratic government, this is really what allows Chandragupta to be so successful. So he builds this empire off of a bureaucratic system, meaning that he's going to have governors who are responsible for ruling small portions of the empire and reporting back to him. We saw that was the way that some of the Mesopotamian civilizations operated, including Persia. We saw it the same in Egypt. So that's a very common thing. Our government has a bureaucracy today. So it's not unusual. In fact, it's something that develops over time very slowly and tends to work quite well. He introduces strict laws and punishments. He standardizes weights and measures. So Chandragupta does a lot to try and solidify India as a legitimate country, a legitimate empire, and have them sort of built up for success. Now, he's going to be succeeded by his grandson, known as Ashoka or Asoka Maurya. So Ashoka really helps to build on what Chandragupta did in a very specific way. So initially, he's a warrior king, he's a conqueror, but he's going to take a turn toward Buddhism, a turn toward religious tolerance, because of something known as the Battle of Kalinga. So there was a small kingdom that Ashoka's army just crushes this kingdom in a battle, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 10,000 dead. And when he witnessed this, he realizes how kind of distressing it actually is, and instead he converts to Buddhism. Because Buddhism had a message of nonviolence. And then he's going to work to spread Buddhism throughout his empire, and then eventually eastward to China by sending missionaries out. Now, the Mauryan Empire is not going to survive forever. Heavy taxes, rebellion are going to lead to kind of a fracturing of the kingdoms, and it will crumble. Not during Ashoka's rule, but after. We'll look at some edicts of Ashoka here. So these kind of should look familiar to you. The right behavior, the Buddhism concepts. These are things that Ashoka spread. So you direct these pillars and put these edicts out there. That people had to be kind. Kindness extended to your prisoners as well. Ashoka became a vegetarian and was concerned about animal welfare and the respect that animals deserve. He sent out those missionaries, that's officers of the faith. He also established medical treatments. I found this one to be quite interesting because these medical treatments would be free to anyone within the empire. He believed it was necessary and important to make sure that people had medical treatment. The roadside facilities is also interesting. So he builds this complex road system throughout India, and then these roadside facilities, like it says, a little bit more fancy maybe than a truck stop today. But if you think about this, if you're on a journey and you're traveling along the road, it's possible that you get hungry. Maybe you didn't pack correctly. And so, that could be a dangerous trip for you. What he did was every so many miles built like these way stations. He would plant groves of trees along the sides of the road to provide shade, and then also fruit trees to provide food to the people passing by, and just kind of tried to make the road system more hospitable, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. The Gupta Empire comes next. Let me get my face out of the way so you can see these numbers. The Gupta Empire is in 320. and it goes until 550. So in the grand scheme, relatively short, about 230 years. But the Gupta Empire is founded by a guy named Chandra Gupta. So two words there, not the same person as Chandragupta Maurya. So Chandra Gupta creates the Gupta Empire. This is known as India's golden age, mainly because of, like we talked about before, an age of prosperity. Art and poetry, as well as architecture, become quite big during this period. The mathematical advances, the concept of zero, decimal points, pi, all of that comes during India and during the Gupta Empire's advents in math, medicine. So more advancements in medicine and astronomy. The Gupta Empire is just an extraordinarily diverse, intellectually diverse period of time. So you're going to see some of this in one of the videos that I'll share with you, and definitely take note of it, especially the art. There's some paintings that are done in this time period, especially in caves, that have a lot of influence on kind of Hindu belief. So the way that the art is done is quite influential there, as well as the math. Of course, now if you look down the bottom right, you can see our numbers, and below them are the Indian numerals, which will go on to eventually going to be adapted by Arabic numerals when the Arabic peoples take over parts of India, and then eventually our numbers come out of that as well. So, Gupta Empire ends much the same way that the Mauryan Empire did. Invasion, fracturing, and that's going to lead to India kind of being really the end of our discussion until later down the road when we talk about the Mughal Empire. If you guys remember when we were talking about British imperialism in the 1800s, we talked about that incident where a lot of the Indian troops were rebelling because there was the story of kind of sealing their ammunition cartridges with pig fat. Right, and how that was to the Indian people, that was very distressing. In this period of time, much of India is under the rule of Islamic powers, and to be able to touch pig or pork in Islamic culture is forbidden. So you could see maybe if that helps you understand that a little bit better. I found that to be something that was quite interesting as well. That story, and I believe that was, late 1800s, leading up to the First World War. With British imperialism there. All right, so anyway, until next time, I hope you guys enjoy all that India has to offer. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Have a good one.